I want to begin by asking a question. Have you ever faced something in your life that felt absolutely impossible? A situation where every door seemed closed, every option ran dry, and hope felt like a distant memory? When we encounter situations in our lives that seem insurmountable, it's easy to feel helpless and overwhelmed. Whether it's a personal crisis, a health challenge, financial difficulties, or a relationship breaking down, we often face problems that appear completely out of our control. In those moments, we may ask ourselves, how am I going to get through this? But the truth we must hold on to is that God specializes in the impossible. Throughout the Bible, we see countless stories of people who found themselves in situations that seemed beyond hope. In fact, many of the miracles we read about are examples of God's ability to handle the impossible. Consider the story of the Israelites trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. With nowhere to go, their situation seemed like a certain death sentence. They were powerless. But God, in His infinite wisdom and power, parted the Red Sea, creating a pathway where there had been none. The impossible became possible because of His intervention. It's not just in grand dramatic moments like these that we see God working in impossible situations. On a personal level, He's always there in our most desperate and challenging moments. The story of the woman with the issue of blood is another beautiful example. For 12 years, she suffered from a condition that no doctor could heal. She had spent all her money seeking help, only to be met with more disappointment. Her situation seemed hopeless, and yet in a single moment of faith, she touched the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed. Her impossible situation became a testimony of God's ability to intervene at the right time and in the right way. God's power is not limited by what we perceive as our capabilities or the constraints of our circumstances. In the natural world, there are laws and boundaries that govern how things work, whether it's physics, biology, or the way we understand time and space. But God operates outside of these boundaries. He is not constrained by the things that limit us. When we face an impossible situation, we often see only the limitations. But God sees an opportunity to display His power, grace, and sovereignty. Where we see a closed door, He sees a way through. Where we see a mountain too high to climb, He sees the path over it. Where we see a broken situation, He sees the possibility of restoration. It's also important to recognize that God's intervention in impossible situations is not just about solving the problem at hand. It's about revealing His nature to us. When we face the impossible, we are invited to lean into God's power and to trust Him more deeply. The impossible situations are opportunities to know God in ways we wouldn't otherwise experience. They draw us closer to Him, teaching us reliance, faith, and humility. When God handles the impossible, He does not only deliver us from our difficulties, but also strengthens and deepens our relationship with Him. Ultimately, God's ability to handle the impossible is a reminder that no matter how difficult or hopeless our circumstances may seem, we are never alone. He is with us every step of the way, and He is more than capable of turning even the most hopeless situations into demonstrations of His miraculous power. So when you find yourself in the midst of an impossible situation, remember that God doesn't shy away from the challenges that overwhelm us. He specializes in them. What's impossible for us is simply an opportunity for God to work in ways we never thought possible. This version expands the key point by elaborating on biblical examples and the deeper meaning of God's ability to handle impossible situations. Let me know if you'd like more details or further adjustments. As human beings, it's natural to want to fix things. We want control. We want solutions. When faced with a difficult or impossible situation, we often turn inward, trying to figure out a way to resolve the problem ourselves. We search for answers, weigh options, and make plans, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. But in those moments, God calls us to do something entirely different. Instead of relying solely on our own understanding or striving to fix everything, God asks us to trust Him. Trust is a vital component of our relationship with God, and it's the key to seeing Him work in impossible situations. Trusting God doesn't mean we have to understand everything, nor does it mean we are expected to figure out every detail of how the situation will unfold. Instead, it means surrendering our need for control and allowing God to do what He does best, handle the impossible in His own way and timing. One of the most profound truths of our faith is that God's ways are not our ways. He operates on a different level with a broader perspective and a greater understanding of what's needed in every situation. When we face a problem, our vision is often limited to our immediate circumstances. We see only the struggle, the obstacles, and the limitations. But God sees the bigger picture. He knows how every detail fits together, how every aspect of our lives is woven into His greater plan. This is where faith comes in. We trust that God knows what's best, even when we don't see how everything will work out. Proverbs 3:05-6 reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him and He will make your paths straight. This passage is clear. We are called to trust God with our whole hearts, not just the parts that make sense to us or the areas where we feel comfortable. Trusting God means letting go of the need to have all the answers. It means acknowledging that our understanding is limited and surrendering the situation to the one who has no limits. One of the most challenging aspects of trust is the waiting period. When we're in the midst of a tough situation, we often want immediate resolution. But trust requires patience. It requires us to hold on even when the breakthrough feels far away. Even when we don't know when or how God will move. God may not always answer right away, but He is always at work, even in the waiting. Our trust in Him is refined during those times, and we are given the chance to rely less on our own strength and more on His. It's important to remember that trusting God is not passive, it's active. It doesn't mean we sit back and do nothing. Trusting God involves actively believing that He is working behind the scenes, even when we don't see immediate results. It also means continuing to take steps forward, even when the path is unclear. Trusting God requires us to keep moving in faith, to continue praying, and to follow His leading, even when the circumstances look bleak. Sometimes the hardest part of trusting God is accepting that His plan may not look the way we imagined. We may have a specific outcome in mind, but God's plans are often much greater than our own. The beauty of trusting God is knowing that His plan is always better, even if it takes us through unexpected twists and turns. We may not understand it all now, but we can trust that God's heart toward us is good and that He is always working for our ultimate good. In the end, trusting God in impossible situations doesn't mean that we won't face challenges. It doesn't mean that life will always be easy, but it does mean that no matter how impossible things may seem, we are not alone. God is with us, and we can rest in the assurance that He will handle what we cannot. Trusting Him frees us from the burden of trying to fix everything on our own and allows us to experience His peace, knowing that He holds our future in His hand. In our lives, we often experience moments when things don't go according to our plans. We pray, we wait, we hope, and yet it feels as though God is taking His time to answer us. During these moments, doubt can creep in. We may wonder if God is hearing our prayers or if He is even concerned with our struggles. However, it's crucial to remember that God's timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. God operates outside the limitations of time that we experience. While we are bound by hours, days, and seasons, God sees all of time at once. To Him, the beginning and the end are not separate. They are part of a single sovereign plan. Our perception of time is often based on our immediate desires or sense of urgency. We want things to happen now, on our schedule, because we see only the situation in front of us. But God's timing, though often different from our own, is always intentional and purposeful. One of the most powerful examples of God's perfect timing is found in the story of Lazarus. In John 11, we see that when Jesus learned that Lazarus was sick, He didn't rush to heal him. Instead, He stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time he arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. His sisters, Mary and Martha, were devastated, and the mourners around them thought it was too late. It seemed like a situation beyond hope, and they questioned why Jesus hadn't come sooner, but Jesus responded with a powerful statement. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. What appeared to be a delay was actually part of God's perfect plan to show his glory in a more profound way. When Jesus arrived, he raised Lazarus from the dead, demonstrating not just his power over death, but also his perfect timing. What the people thought was a delay was in fact an opportunity for Jesus to reveal his divine authority in a way that would strengthen their faith and bring glory to God. This story teaches us an essential lesson. God's delays are not denials. When he doesn't act according to our timeline, it doesn't mean he has forgotten about us or that he is not concerned with our situation. Instead, it may mean that he is waiting for the right moment when his intervention will have the greatest impact, not just for us, but for others around us as well. God often uses delays to prepare us, to refine our faith, and to get us to a place where we are more fully dependent on him. Sometimes we may feel like God is silent during our waiting periods, but this silence isn't abandonment. It's simply that God's plan is unfolding behind the scenes, and he is working things out in ways we cannot see. We may not understand why things aren't happening on our timeline, but we can trust that God is orchestrating everything according to his perfect will. Our trust in him grows when we surrender our timelines and embrace his. There is also something powerful about waiting on God's timing. It stretches our faith, teaching us patience, endurance, and perseverance. It reminds us that we are not in control, but God is. Waiting forces us to confront our need for God and to learn to rely on him fully. It also gives God space to work in our hearts, preparing us to receive his blessings at just the right time. Additionally, God's timing can be tied to the timing of others. Sometimes our breakthrough is not just about us. God may be waiting for the right moment to align circumstances in such a way that we not only experience his answer, but also see the bigger picture of how his plan affects those around us. The timing of our breakthrough may intersect with someone else's need, and when it happens, it becomes a testimony not just for us, but for everyone involved. Ultimately, understanding and trusting in God's perfect timing can bring peace to our hearts, especially when we feel anxious or frustrated by delays. We can take comfort in knowing that while we may not always understand why things happen when they do, we can trust that God's timing is always for our good and his glory. He is never late, and he is always right on time. At times in our lives, we find ourselves crying out to God for answers, but there are moments when it seems like he is silent. We pray, seek his guidance, and ask for his intervention, yet the response we hope for doesn't come in the way we expect or desire. This silence can feel like abandonment, and it can stir up confusion and doubt. But in truth, God's silence doesn't mean he's absent. It doesn't mean he's forgotten about us or that he isn't listening. Rather, his silence is often a powerful reminder that he is working behind the scenes in ways we cannot see or understand. God's silence is not a reflection of his lack of care for us. In fact, it can be an indication of something much deeper. It is in these moments of apparent silence that we are invited to deepen our faith and trust in him. God often uses silence to draw us closer to him, to teach us that he is not just a means to an end, but the ultimate source of peace, comfort, and strength. His silence can lead us into a season of growth, where we are forced to rely on what we already know about his character, rather than waiting for a specific answer to our request. In Psalm 46:10, we are reminded, "Be still and know that I am God." This is not a passive command, but one that requires active surrender and trust. Sometimes when God is silent, he is calling us to be still, to cease striving, to stop trying to fix everything on our own, and to simply rest in the knowledge that he is God. His silence in these moments can be a time for us to focus on his sovereignty, to shift our attention away from the noise and the urgency of our problems, and to remember that he is in control of everything, even when we don't have all the answers. When we look at the story of Job in the Bible, we see an example of how God's silence can bring about profound spiritual growth. Job endured immense suffering and loss. His wealth, his health, and his family were all taken from him. Throughout his suffering, Job cried out to God, seeking answers to his pain. Yet, for much of his journey, God did not respond directly to his questions. Instead, Job had to wrestle with the silence, learning to trust God even when he couldn't understand why he was going through such hardship. When God finally spoke to Job, it wasn't to answer his specific questions or to explain the reasons for his suffering. Rather, God revealed himself in his greatness, reminding Job of his wisdom, power, and sovereignty. Job's response was one of humility and awe, as he realized that God's ways were beyond his comprehension. This story highlights an important truth. Sometimes God's silence is not about withholding answers, but about revealing more of himself to us. God doesn't owe us explanations, and his silence doesn't mean he is absent or uncaring. Instead, it may be his way of teaching us to trust him without needing to have everything figured out. In those moments of quiet, God invites us to draw closer to him and to acknowledge that he is enough, even if we don't have the answers we seek. There are also times when God's silence is his way of preparing us for something greater. We may feel as though he is distant or unresponsive, but he is often working behind the scenes in ways we cannot see. Just as a seed must be buried in the soil, hidden and out of sight before it can sprout and grow, so too must we sometimes be in a place of quiet waiting before God brings about the next season of growth and blessing in our lives. His silence may be a time of preparation, both for us and for the situation at hand, before he moves in a powerful way. Furthermore, God's silence is not a sign of weakness on his part. In fact, in our world, silence often speaks volumes. Think about how silence can sometimes be more powerful than words. It holds weight, meaning, and depth. Similarly, when God is silent, he is not ignoring us. He is allowing us the space to grow, to search our hearts, and to develop a deeper dependence on him. His silence often leads us to a place where we no longer rely on external answers or temporary fixes, but we come to a deeper realization that God himself is the answer, and his presence is enough to sustain us through any challenge. So when we find ourselves in a season of silence from God, it's important to resist the temptation to think that he has forgotten us. Instead, we should embrace the silence as an opportunity to grow closer to him. Even in his silence, he is speaking to us in profound ways. He is teaching us, shaping us, and preparing us for the next step in his plan for our lives. In these moments, we must trust that God is still at work, even when we can't see or hear him directly. His silence is not a sign of absence, but an invitation to deepen our trust and dependence on him. Often, when we face an impossible situation, it feels like the world is closing in around us. The weight of the struggle can be overwhelming, and we may even wonder if there is any purpose in the pain. However, there is a powerful truth that we must cling to. What seems like our greatest trial can actually become a platform for God's glory. God has a way of using the very things that threaten to break us as opportunities to show his power, grace, and faithfulness to the world. When we experience hardship, it's easy to focus solely on the difficulty in front of us, and rightly so. Pain and loss are not to be minimized, and we shouldn't ignore the very real struggles we face. But we must also understand that God doesn't waste our suffering. While it's hard to see in the moment, God is working behind the scenes to bring about something greater than we can imagine. Our struggles can become the very place where God reveals himself to others in profound ways. Consider the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph's life was marked by betrayal, false accusations, and imprisonment. His brothers sold him into slavery, and he spent years in difficult circumstances. Yet, through it all, Joseph never lost faith in God. At the end of his journey, when he had risen to a place of authority in Egypt, he looked back at the hardships he had endured and declared, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What appeared to be a series of tragic events became the very means by which God saved an entire nation. Joseph's suffering became a platform for the display of God's purpose and power, not only for Joseph himself, but for the nation of Israel and beyond. This truth is not limited to the stories of the Bible. It applies to our lives today as well. When we go through trials, others are watching. Whether we realize it or not, our responses to suffering, our faith, our perseverance, our trust in God serve as a testimony to the world around us. People may look at how we handle hardship and wonder, how do they remain so steadfast? How do they keep going when everything seems lost? And in those moments, our faith becomes the very thing that points others to God. Our impossible situations, when surrendered to God, can become powerful testimonies of His ability to bring good out of even the worst circumstances. There are countless examples of people who have faced life's most difficult challenges and through God's grace have come out stronger on the other side, with their face shining brighter. Many people who have suffered through illness, financial ruin, or loss have used their experiences to encourage others in similar situations. Their stories of resilience and trust in God have become beacons of hope to others who are struggling. The pain they endured became the very thing that allowed them to minister to others and bring glory to God. Even Jesus, the Son of God, faced the ultimate trial of His crucifixion. It seemed like the greatest defeat, a moment of utter loss, pain, and despair. But what appeared to be the end was actually the beginning of the greatest victory the world has ever known. Through His death, Jesus brought salvation to humanity. And through His resurrection, He demonstrated God's power over death itself. What looked like an impossible situation became the ultimate platform for God's glory, and it changed the course of history forever. It's also important to remember that God often uses our struggles to refine us. The challenges we face are not just about what happens externally, they are also about what God is doing inside of us. Through hardship, God shapes our character, builds our perseverance, and deepens our relationship with Him. Our suffering doesn't just become a platform for God's glory in the world, it also becomes a tool for our own spiritual growth. The more we surrender to God during our trials, the more we reflect His glory to those around us. When we see our struggles as opportunities for God to work through us, it changes our perspective. We stop viewing hardship as a burden to bear alone and start seeing it as an invitation to partner with God in something greater than ourselves. We begin to trust that even in the midst of pain, God is at work, not only to bring us through the trial, but to use us as vessels for His glory. Ultimately, our impossible situations are not just about us. They are part of a much bigger story that God is writing, a story that includes us, yes, but also the lives of everyone who is watching us walk through that struggle. When we lean into God during our hardships, when we trust Him to handle the impossible, we allow Him to use our pain for a purpose far beyond our understanding. Our suffering becomes a platform where His grace, love, and power are on display for the world to see, and in that He is glorified. In the midst of impossible situations, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. We become so consumed by the challenge at hand, focused on the obstacles and the seeming impossibilities, that we forget about God's overarching plans for our lives. Yet it is crucial to remember that God's plans for us are always good, even when the immediate circumstances appear grim. In every trial and every struggle, God is working something greater than we can comprehend. He is orchestrating events behind the scenes in ways that ultimately serve His purpose and our good. The reality is that God doesn't just work in the here and now, He works in the eternal. While we may be consumed with our present difficulties, God is already thinking about how our trials will fit into the larger story of our lives. He is not bound by time, and he sees the beginning from the end. His plans for us are full of hope, and they are meant to bring us to a place of growth, maturity, and eventual triumph. While it may feel like we are lost in the middle of an impossible situation, we must trust that God is using this moment to shape us for something far greater than we can imagine. There is a powerful passage in the Bible that reminds us of this truth. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. This verse is a promise that God has a good plan for our lives, even when our current circumstances suggest otherwise. It's a reminder that God's heart for us is filled with goodness. And even though the road we walk may be difficult, he is always working to bring about his perfect plan. Sometimes we have to endure hardships because those struggles are an integral part of the process that leads to the fulfillment of God's greater purposes. One of the most beautiful aspects of God's plans is that he uses even the most painful moments to bring about his purposes. Think about how God used the trials of the Apostle Paul to advance the gospel. Paul faced imprisonment, shipwrecks, beatings, and countless other hardships throughout his ministry. Yet through it all, he remained faithful, and God used his suffering as a testimony that spread the message of Christ across the Roman Empire. Paul himself acknowledged that his hardships were part of God's greater plan. In Philippians 1:12, he wrote, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." What seemed like setbacks and suffering were in fact part of God's ultimate plan for spreading his message of salvation to the world. When we look at our own lives, we can take comfort in knowing that God works in the same way. The trials and challenges we face are not wasted. They serve a greater purpose in God's plan. Even when we cannot see the reason behind our struggles, we can trust that God is using them for our growth and for the fulfillment of his kingdom. This understanding shifts our perspective from one of frustration and confusion to one of faith and hope. We begin to see that God is not distant or indifferent to our pain, but that he is intimately involved in every aspect of our lives, guiding us toward his perfect outcome. Another key aspect of God's greater plan is that he does not work alone. He invites us to be active participants in his purposes. While he is the one who orchestrates the events of our lives, he calls us to trust him, lean on him, and take steps of faith, even when the path ahead is unclear. God's plan for us involves not just his work, but our obedience and our willingness to follow him wherever he leads. The impossible situations we face are not just challenges to endure, but opportunities to trust, grow, and participate in his redemptive work in the world. Moreover, we can take comfort in the fact that God's timing is always in alignment with his plan. While we may wish for an immediate resolution to our problems, God's timing ensures that we receive what we need at the right moment. His perfect timing allows us to experience the fullness of his plan for our lives, even when we cannot see the end from the beginning. It's like a puzzle. Each piece is crucial, and God knows exactly when each piece needs to fall into place for his masterpiece to be complete. Ultimately, the assurance that God is working a greater plan in the midst of our impossible situations gives us the strength to endure. We are not walking through our struggles alone. God is actively involved, shaping and molding us for something greater than we could ever imagine. This understanding enables us to face the challenges of life with faith, knowing that even when we can't see how things will work out, God is already at work, fulfilling his perfect plan in our lives. In conclusion, when faced with impossible situations, we are called to trust in God's sovereignty, knowing that he is not only able to handle our challenges, but is working behind the scenes to bring about his perfect will for our lives. From the beginning to the end, he is in control, and his timing is always perfect, even when it feels like we're waiting in silence. Through these struggles, God invites us to deepen our faith, trust in his plan, and believe that he is using these moments for our growth and his glory. Our trials are not wasted. They serve a purpose greater than we can understand. And in those moments, we are never alone. God's strength, grace, and faithfulness carry us through, and ultimately his greater plan unfolds, bringing us closer to the person he created us to be. So let go of your worry and surrender your impossible situation to him, knowing that in his hands, nothing is impossible. God will handle what you cannot, and his work will be a testimony to his power, love, and perfect will.